At my brother's funeral, someone behind me whispered, "Is that her? The one who got kicked out of the army?" I didn't even turn around, because before I could, a voice cut through the murmurs, "You're Lieutenant Colonel Vega." It had been 5 years since I set foot in my hometown of Waco, Texas, and the only reason I came back was because my little brother, Sergeant Elijah Vega, had come home in a flag-draped coffin. The church was full of uniforms, full of folded hands, full of people who once called our family honor-bound. And yet, as I stood alone near the back, silent, unnoticed, their glances landed on me like quiet accusations. I didn't wear my uniform, not because I didn't still own it, but because when you resign in disgrace, even the cloth you once wore with pride starts to feel like someone else's skin. They all remembered what they thought they knew, that I'd left the army after an incident, that I had shamed the Vega name. No one asked what happened. They didn't want nuance. They wanted someone to blame. And I, Alexandra Vega, fit the bill. The golden daughter who fell from grace. My parents hadn't hugged me when I arrived. My uncle turned his back mid-handshake. My mother stood at the front pew, clutching Elijah's medals, but didn't meet my eyes once. Even now at his funeral, I was still a ghost. The sister who left. The one who failed. And then, a man stepped forward. Tall, broad-shouldered, silver at the temples, a chest full of service ribbons. His gaze landed on me unwavering. The air shifted. He walked straight toward me through the rows of grieving soldiers, his polished boots thudding softly against the marble floor. Whispers fell silent. His voice, however, did not. "You're Lieutenant Colonel Vega?" It wasn't a question. Not really. It was a recognition, a restoration. I straightened my spine, heart thudding. For the first time in 5 years, someone didn't look at me with shame. He looked at me like I mattered, like I had once commanded fire and maybe still could. 5 years ago, I stood on a different kind of battlefield. Not the kind marked by dust and gunfire, but one with polished floors, glass walls, and closed-door briefings held behind layers of security clearance and veiled threats. I was Lieutenant Colonel Alexandra Vega, Strategic Intelligence Command qualified, and at 33, the youngest woman ever promoted to that rank in my division. I had led 6 successful cross-border operations, earned 2 Bronze Stars, and helped dismantle a major arms smuggling network that had been feeding weapons into unstable regions for years. My name was on Pentagon briefings. I was whispered about in halls filled with men who wore stars on their collars. And then, everything unraveled. The operation was called Crimson Wind. We were targeting a supply convoy in northern Syria, believed to be carrying high-level operatives and arms linked to black market trafficking. The intel was time-sensitive, and I pushed for a green light after cross-checking our satellite recon ground reports and signal intercepts. We deployed a small elite team. I oversaw it remotely from our FOB. It should have been textbook. But within 10 minutes of boots on the ground, something went wrong. An IED exploded near the convoy. 4 soldiers were killed instantly. One of them was 22. 2 others were wounded. The extraction was chaotic. The mission was a failure, and before the blood had dried, I was the name on the line. The media ate it alive. Rogue Lieutenant Colonel orders faulty strike. Reckless female officer. Costs lives in Syria. What they didn't know, what I couldn't say, was this: I wasn't the one who approved the mission. My commanding officer, General Marcus Grafton, had pushed the timeline forward. He overruled my request to wait for a secondary drone pass. But when it all fell apart, he denied giving the order, and I was left standing alone in the line of fire. There was a closed inquiry, of course, a private military tribunal. All quiet, all contained. But Grafton had friends, senators, donors, people who didn't want a decorated general dragged through the mud. So they offered me a choice. Take the blame quietly. Accept early resignation with full medical benefits. Disappear from the chain of command. Or fight and lose everything. And so I signed the papers, not because I was guilty, but because I was tired, because I knew what the fight would cost, because I had seen too many good officers chewed up by the system and tossed aside screaming into the void. When I walked out of the Pentagon that day, the sky was bright, too bright, the kind of light that feels like it's trying to blind you. I remember sitting on a bench outside the security gate, holding my resignation folder on my lap like a tombstone. My phone buzzed with media requests, old classmates asking, "Is it true?" But not one message from my family, not even from my mother. They didn't ask for details. They didn't want to understand. In their eyes, I'd tarnished the Vega name. I'd failed. I tried explaining once. I called my father. I did what I had to, I said. It wasn't just about me. He was silent for a long time before saying, "Maybe you should stop talking about the military for a while. It's making your mother upset." That was the end of it. After that, I stopped calling. I moved across the country, changed numbers, changed everything. I found work doing intelligence consulting for private firms, but I never put my full name on anything. I slipped into the quiet. But one person never stopped reaching out. Elijah, my little brother, 5 years younger. The same boy who used to chase me down the hallway in plastic body armor shouting, "Mission go" as a kid. He'd followed me into the army, not into intel, but into the infantry. Different paths, but the same blood. Even after everything happened, he called, not every day, not even every week, but every few months I'd see a missed call with a strange number and hear his voice on a garbled voicemail. "Hey, Lieutenant Colonel, guess what I made Sergeant? Got another deployment coming up. Don't worry, I'll be fine. I've been learning from the best. Right, I told the guys in my unit that my sister once ran ops that made the news. They didn't believe me. I let them Google you. They shut up real fast. He never once called me a failure. He never once asked what happened. Not because he didn't care, but because he already knew it didn't matter. I was still his sister, still the one he looked up to, still the one who taught him how to field strip a rifle before he could legally vote. Sometimes his calls would come at 2 a.m., and I'd lie there in the dark, phone pressed to my chest, listening to the weight of the life I'd left behind breathing on the other end. It was like a lifeline, like someone still believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. So when the call came last week that Elijah was dead, KIA, just 3 weeks from coming home, I didn't think. I just packed a bag and flew home. Because for 5 years I had disappeared. But now I was going to stand where I should have stood all along, even if it meant facing the ghosts I left behind. The day of Elijah's funeral, the Texas sky was heavy with gray, as if even the weather couldn't decide whether to weep or hold it in. I arrived quietly, slipping into the side entrance of the church before the service began. No uniform, no insignia. Just a dark navy coat, plain slacks, and my hair tied back in a tight, almost defiant knot. I hadn't worn my bars in 5 years, and I wasn't about to start now, not for show, not for them. The pews were packed with men and women in uniform, young soldiers with crisp collars and grieving eyes, and older veterans with medals pinned like memories. The Vega family sat in the front row, rigid and proper. My mother didn't look back when I entered, neither did my father. I found a seat near the back. No one sat beside me. People noticed. Of course they did. One by one, their eyes flickered to the last row, to the one they'd whispered about. I saw a woman elbow her husband subtly. I caught the hushed murmur from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. "That's her right, the one who got kicked out of the army." The words weren't cruel, just cold, like labeling a file and sliding it into a drawer. I kept my eyes on the casket. Elijah's flag was folded with precision, corners sharp. A photo of him in uniform sat next to it, full of life. His crooked grin, that ever too long hair, eyes too young for the medals on his chest. I wanted to reach out, touch the wood, whisper something no one else would hear. But I stayed where I was. I wasn't there for redemption. I was there because he would have done the same for me. The pastor began to speak. Scripture, eulogies, and memories from fellow soldiers. My parents nodded solemnly, accepting folded flags and final salutes like they were porcelain gifts, fragile, ceremonial, breakable. When the service ended, we moved outside. The sky had broken open by then, drizzling cold Texas rain, soft as mist but insistent. The honor guard fired 3 rounds. A lone bugle cried out the first notes of taps. And still, no one looked at me. Not my mother, who had once kissed my forehead before deployment like it might be the last time. Not my uncle, who taught me how to ride a bike and then stopped returning my calls when the news broke. Not a single member of my family acknowledged I existed, until he did. A man stepped away from the crowd. His uniform was immaculate, pressed. Medals are perfectly placed. His hair was steel gray, cropped short, and his face was weathered but watchful. Colonel Thomas Grayson, Elijah's commanding officer. He walked slowly, each step deliberate, almost hesitant. I saw a few soldiers turn to watch him. The rain fell between us like a curtain. Then he stopped just a few feet away. He looked at me. Looked. Not through me, not what I used to be, but who I was standing there in the quiet. Something shifted in his posture. He spoke, his voice deep and steady, but not unkind. "You're Lieutenant Colonel Vega." It wasn't a demand, it wasn't suspicion. It was recognition, respect, surprise. Like he was confirming a rumor he hadn't dared to believe. I didn't answer right away. I didn't know if I could. My throat was tight. The air was heavy. The moment was too still. So I just nodded. Once. And something in his face softened. He stepped closer, close enough that his next words were just for me, but loud enough that those around us could hear. "Your brother, Elijah. He told us you once saved an entire squad during a black site extraction." I didn't believe him. He was always telling stories about you. He paused a breath, then looked me dead in the eye. But now, I believe him. Everything stopped. The low murmur of idle conversation, the gentle rustle of dress blues in the wind, it all went silent. Heads turned. Eyes found me again. But this time, it wasn't with disdain. It was something else. Confusion, curiosity, and for some shame. Grayson nodded again, like he had said what needed to be said. Like he was setting the record straight, not just for himself, but for every person who had buried me in silence the past 5 years. Then he saluted. Not a casual nod, not a polite gesture, a salute. And for a moment, the air returned to my lungs. No one else said a word, but they didn't have to. That one gesture shattered 5 years of whispers, 5 years of invisible blame, 5 years of pretending I didn't exist. In one silent moment, he restored a name they had tried to erase. Lieutenant Colonel Vega. That was who I was. Still. And now they knew it too. The day after the funeral, the silence was louder than the rifles had been. I stayed in the guest room of a cousin's house on the edge of town. No one offered to have me closer. I didn't ask. The room was cold, sparsely furnished, and smelled faintly of cedar and mothballs. But it was quiet, and in that quiet, I could finally grieve. Not just for Elijah, but for the pieces of myself that had been slowly dying for years. I hadn't unpacked, just sat by the window watching the wind press against the oak trees in the yard. My phone was still off. I didn't want condolences from people who hadn't spoken my name in half a decade. That's when the knock came. 3 short taps, sharp, measured, military. I opened the door to find a young man standing on the porch in a weather-worn army jacket, boots still dusted with red soil. His posture was stiff, formal, but his eyes held something else. Not grief, not pity. Fear. "Ma'am," he said, clearing his throat, "you don't know me, but I served with your brother, in his unit." I nodded slowly, stepping aside without a word. He didn't sit. Just stood there in the living room, hands shaking slightly, as he pulled a small envelope from his pocket. Inside was a USB drive. Black. Unmarked. He gave it to me before the last op. The soldier said quietly. "Told me, if anything happened, to get it to you. No one else, just you." My mouth went dry. My fingers curled around the plastic, strangely heavy for its size. "What's on it?" I asked. He hesitated, then looked me straight in the eye. Everything. Back in the guest room, I plugged the drive into my laptop. No password, no encryption. Elijah knew better than to complicate it. A folder appeared on screen, titled Sparrow Red. Inside were videos, scans of maps, intercepted radio transmissions, even night vision helmet cam footage. I recognized the terrain immediately: northern Syria near the Turkish border, the place where Elijah had died. And then I saw it. A video clip time-stamped 2 days before the operation that took his life. Elijah's voice whispering into the camera. He looked tired, wired, but determined. I don't know whom I can trust. But I found something bad. There's movement coming through the green zone, not from the enemy, but from our side. Crates. Sealed. No logs. No manifests. I tried to ask command and they shut it down fast, told me to leave it. But I can't. He looked down, then back at the camera. If I don't make it back, this wasn't an accident. This wasn't just war. Somebody wants to keep this quiet. But Alex, I know you'll know what to do. I pressed pause. The air left my lungs like I'd been punched. I sat still, staring at the frozen frame of his face. I hadn't heard my name in his voice since his last voicemail. And now, even in death, he was still reaching for me. I opened the rest of the files, and as I did, a picture began to form. Elijah had discovered a covert supply line, unauthorized weapons transfers, masked as routine aid drops. High-grade rifles, drone parts, ammunition in unmarked crates, none of it is accounted for in military systems. The kind of hardware that doesn't just go missing. There were names attached, not many but enough. One was familiar. Colonel Hensley, Logistics Command, a man who had once served under General Grafton, my former superior. It wasn't hard to connect the dots. Elijah had uncovered a shadow operation, likely sanctioned or ignored by higher-ups who didn't want the paper trail. And then, conveniently, he'd been sent on a high-risk op with unreliable intel. Except Elijah had never gone in blind. That wasn't who he was. They'd sent him anyway, and now he was gone, not lost in war, erased. I sat there for a long time. The laptop screen went black, but the files stayed burned behind my eyes. My fingers clenched the arms of the chair, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel ashamed of the fire rising in my chest. I had once taken the fall for a cover-up like this, believing it would stop with me. I was wrong. And now my little brother was dead, because someone thought no one would ask questions. Because they thought I was gone. Broken. Out of reach. They were wrong too. The next morning I woke before sunrise. I didn't pack much, just my laptop, the USB, a leather-bound notebook I'd kept since my Intel days. I took one last look at the house, at the room where no one had come to check on me, and walked out. The wind was sharp. My spine felt straighter than it had in years. This time, I wouldn't go quietly. I wasn't here to reclaim my old rank or my family's approval. I didn't care if the newspapers ever corrected the record. I was here for Elijah, for the truth, and for the people who still thought they could bury both. The hardest part of war isn't what happens on the battlefield. It's what happens after, when silence replaces gunfire, and truth becomes something people are afraid to say out loud. I knew if I wanted justice for Elijah, I couldn't storm back into the system like a fury unleashed. That would only feed their narrative that I was emotional, unstable, unfit. No, this had to be quiet, precise, surgical. So I made one phone call. Rachel King. We'd served together on a multi-agency task force years ago. She had a law degree from Georgetown, a sharp tongue, and an even sharper memory. She was one of the few who believed me back then when I'd taken the fall for Operation Crimson Wind. When I called her, I didn't explain everything. I didn't need to. I have something I said, and I think it's bigger than anyone realizes. There was a pause, then the sound of her breath catching. Where are you back in D.C. tomorrow? Good. Bring everything. Within 48 hours, we were sitting in her office walls lined with case files, commendations, and a framed photo of her unit. She didn't waste time. I handed her the USB. Elijah recorded everything. She plugged it in, watched, listened. Her jaw clenched. Her eyes stayed locked on the screen as Elijah's voice spilled through the speakers. When the last video clip ended, she looked at me and said, "This is enough to burn half the chain of command." "No," I corrected gently. "It's enough to start asking why no one stopped it." Rachel reached for her phone. "We're going to reopen the case." The process wasn't loud. It couldn't be. Rachel called in a handful of trusted investigators, people who still believed in the oath they swore, people who had served long enough to know when something smelled wrong. We didn't issue press statements, we didn't wave flags, we compiled records, we subpoenaed logs. We confirmed Elijah's findings with additional sources, some who had been too afraid to speak up until now. And then we requested an emergency hearing before the Senate Armed Services Subcommittee on Military Oversight. It was granted. The hearing would be closed door, but on record. One chance to tell the truth to the right people with the right weight behind every word. I hadn't been inside a government building in years, but when I stepped through the security checkpoint at the Capitol, something shifted in me. It wasn't rage. It wasn't revenge. It was something quieter, more resolute. It was justice steadying her feet. They gave me a visitor's badge, escort clearance, a seat behind the microphone with a placard that read, "Lieutenant Colonel Alexandra Vega. Witness." Across the table sat General McCallan, the man who had signed the paperwork that ended my career, the man who had said, "We appreciate your sacrifice," when I took the fall for something he authorized. He looked older, not weaker, just more guarded. He didn't recognize me at first. That part made me smile just a little. Then I started speaking. I began with Elijah. I told them who he was, not just as a soldier, but as a brother, as a man of conscience, a man who loved this country so much that he risked everything to do the right thing. Then I opened the file. I played Elijah's final video. I laid out the documents. I traced the route of the unregistered weapons. I named names, not accusations, but facts, signatures, dates, dispatch logs, satellite coordinates. Rachel supported every claim with corroborating evidence. She didn't flinch. Neither did I. And then I turned to McCallan. "Sir," I said, my voice steady, "you dismissed me from service 5 years ago for insubordination. But what I did then, what I'm doing now, is exactly what my oath demanded of me. I told the truth." He shifted in his seat. I continued. "This time the truth cost my brother his life. And unless someone in this room dares to care more about that than about preserving their rank, it will happen again." A long silence followed. Then one of the senators asked McCallan directly, "General, were you aware of the unauthorized transfers referenced here?" McCallan opened his mouth, closed it, then finally said, "I'll need to review the documents." But it was too late. The hearing ended with a motion to suspend McCallan pending formal investigation. And as I walked out, the aide assigned to Elijah's case tapped my shoulder gently. "We're reclassifying his death," she said. "It will no longer be listed as a standard combat fatality. It will be marked as an unresolved incident under active investigation." She paused. "His name deserves better. And now, he'll have it." I nodded. My voice caught in my throat. That was all I ever wanted. Not revenge, just the truth. And the dignity he earned. Outside, the sky over D.C. was clear, crisp, not unlike the morning I left this city in disgrace. But this time, I wasn't leaving in silence. This time, I had spoken. And this time, someone listened. Someone. It happened quietly, the way the most important things sometimes do. A single phone call, a time, a location. No headlines, no ceremony. But the voice on the other end of the line wasn't just anyone. "This is Secretary Norwood," she said. "Lieutenant Colonel Vega, we'd like to meet with you." I was in the kitchen of a small rental apartment in D.C. when the call came, elbows on the table, coffee half cold. I'd spent the last week tying loose ends, submitting statements, and helping Rachel complete her brief for the Inspector General. I hadn't planned on staying long. I wasn't trying to make a comeback. But the Department of Defense had other plans. They met me in a secure room at the Pentagon. Clean, simple, 2 flags, 1 American, 1 Army. A pot of coffee that no one touched. Secretary Norwood sat across from me. Her face was calm, deliberate. She didn't waste words. "Lieutenant Colonel," she said, "on behalf of the Department of Defense, I'd like to offer our formal apology. What happened to you 5 years ago should never have been allowed. You took the fall for the wrong person. We see that now." I didn't speak. I just nodded. I wasn't here for sorry. I was here for something more honest. Then she added, "But we don't just owe you an apology, we owe you a position. The kind of role that matches your capability, your integrity." She slid a folder across the table. Inside, a recommendation to reinstate my active status at full rank, but not to any old post, to command. A newly reorganized Joint Intelligence and Ethics Unit tasked with internal audits, field-based investigations, and operational oversight. The kind of work I once believed in before politics got in the way. I looked up. "You're asking me to come back." Norwood met my eyes. "I'm not asking you to erase what happened. I'm asking you to help make sure it doesn't happen again." I closed the folder, and after a long pause I said softly, "Then we do this my way." The official ceremony wasn't publicized. It wasn't meant for cameras, it was for soldiers, for truth, and for one name in particular, Elijah James Vega. The Army arranged a private memorial to correct his record. It was held at Fort Cresswell, the base where Elijah trained, where I had once led missions from, and where our family name had first begun. I stood at the back of the crowd in my dress blues. They'd tailored them last minute, but they still felt like mine. The silver eagle insignia caught the light just enough to make people turn. This time, the whispers weren't about shame. They were about to return, and about the kind of story that doesn't end in silence. The flag was lifted. A new plaque was revealed, in honor of Sergeant Elijah Vega, for courage, clarity, and sacrifice beyond the call of duty. It felt like a piece of him had finally come home. And then Colonel Grayson stepped onto the platform. Same uniform, same steely calm, but this time something different in his voice, less formality, more reverence. "It's rare to meet someone who rewrites history with silence," he began. But Lieutenant Colonel Alexandra Vega didn't need volume. She just needed truth. He turned, facing me directly. "Ma'am, your old unit's been watching and waiting. The men and women you once led and those who came after know who you are, and we're proud to serve with someone like you again." He reached into a small box and pulled out a single patch, the emblem of the 213th Strategic Intel Task Force. "Lieutenant Colonel Vega," he said, voice firm but kind. "Your unit is waiting for a new commanding officer." He paused, letting the words hang. "Are you ready?" I didn't answer with words. I stepped forward. Grayson saluted. I returned it. Then, with steady hands, I took the patch and pressed it onto my uniform just above the heart. The crowd, dozens of officers, enlisted soldiers, civilians, erupted. No roar. No theatrics. But a collective breath, a ripple of nods, a release of something that had been held too long. It wasn't just about me. It was about Elijah. About everyone who had ever been told to stay quiet. About every mistake that was finally being named out loud. After the ceremony, I stood alone for a while beside my brother's plaque. My fingers traced the letters. The stone was smooth, cool, resolute. "We're not done," I whispered. "But we're not buried anymore." When I turned to leave, several junior officers approached. One saluted. "Ma'am, welcome back." And for the first time in years, I believed it. I didn't come back to reclaim a throne. I came back to restore a name. Elijah's. And in the process, something I never expected happened. Mine was restored too. It wasn't revenge. That word implies fire, fury, and destruction. This was different. This was about clarity. About putting something broken back in place, without fanfare or fury, just focus. I was offered several roles after the hearing, each one tempting in its way. Command opportunities, advisory boards, teaching positions at West Point. But I turned most of them down. Because I didn't want a podium. I wanted a purpose. So I said yes to the one that mattered. Special Advisor to the Office of Internal Military Security, an independent division under the Department of Defense, tasked with identifying and dismantling corruption mismanagement and suppressed whistleblowing inside the armed forces. It was a role built for someone who knew what it was like to be buried under silence and to claw their way back. My office was modest. A single nameplate. A team of analysts and field operatives who reported directly to me. Most of them were younger. Some had almost quit. One told me during our first briefing, "Ma'am, I read your file when I was deciding whether to leave. It kept me in. That was enough. I didn't want loyalty. I wanted truth-tellers. People who didn't care about rank if rank meant silence." Our first investigation exposed a fraudulent supply chain network in a domestic training program. The second uncovered a black site recon mission that had been classified to avoid public scrutiny, not for national security, but to hide a mistake. Each case brought its own ghosts, but we didn't flinch. And slowly word began to spread. Vega doesn't bury things. She exhumes them. Back home, the story was different. I never received an apology from my family. That kind of humility doesn't grow in people who spent years pretending their absence was deserved. My mother never said the words, "I'm sorry." But the next time I visited, she left a newspaper on the kitchen counter. My photo is on the cover. The headline, "From Disgrace to Decorated, the Return of Lieutenant Colonel Alexandra Vega." She didn't mention it. Neither did I. That was her version of reaching out, and in her way, it was enough. At a family gathering months later, someone passed me the sweet tea without making a snide comment. A cousin who once told people I'd lost it overseas now asked gently, "Do you like your new position?" No one laughed. No one turned their back. And maybe that's all the justice some families are capable of, silence replaced by respect. I didn't need their guilt. I only needed their doubt to stop shaping who I was. One evening after work, I found myself walking through Arlington. I stopped by Elijah's name etched in stone, now not just in memory. The Army had placed a gold plaque next to it, "Service above self." I traced the letters slowly. "They don't talk over me anymore," I whispered, "and they'll never erase you again." I didn't cry. I didn't have to, because grief had evolved into something stronger legacy. A week later, I stood in front of a classroom at the National Defense University. I wasn't scheduled to speak, but Rachel had asked me to drop in. The cadets were sharp, curious. A few recognized me. One raised his hand. "Ma'am, if you could go back, would you do it differently? Would you speak up louder the first time? Would you fight harder?" I paused, then said quietly, "No, I would listen more closely to the silence. That's where the truth hides." They wrote that down. And I realized that maybe this too was part of coming back. Not just to expose what was broken, but to help build something better in its place. So yes, I returned. Not for revenge, but to ensure no one else's brother dies thinking his truth will be buried. To lead teams that make space for the unheard. To answer the question whispered behind my back for years, "Is that her? The one who failed? No, that's her. The one who returned anyway. And this time I am not leaving." It was a Sunday afternoon when the words finally came. The light spilled through the blinds in long golden slants. Outside my window, Fort Cresswell stood steady barracks lined in quiet order flags, stirring in a gentle wind, voices of young cadets calling drills in the distance. Life moved forward as it always does, but I wasn't rushing to keep up with it anymore. That day I sat down at my desk, pulled out a sheet of stationery, and started writing, not for a report, not for a committee, not for the Department of Defense, but for my mother. The pen moved slowly, steadily, each word heavier than the last. I hadn't written her in years, and yet the words arrived as if they had been waiting for me all along. "Dear Mom, I didn't come back to prove you wrong. I didn't come back to fix the stories you believed about me. I came back because Elijah believed something bigger, that I still had something true to give. And for the first time in years, I believe that too. I didn't expect you to understand. I didn't need you to. But I needed you to know this time I'm not running. Love, Alex." I folded the letter carefully. No dramatic ending, No demands for closure, just truth, plain and unadorned. And that was enough. Outside, the day stretched on. I walked out onto the base, letting the breeze meet my face. The sun touched my skin with that late afternoon warmth that only comes when the day has nothing left to prove. In the near distance, I saw a training unit lining up on the field, fresh recruits barely in their 20s. I watched as they took formation, stumbling slightly, laughing under their breath, still trying to figure out what discipline meant outside of a textbook. One of them glanced toward me, eyes widening when he recognized the bars on my chest. "Ma'am," he called out. "Lieutenant Colonel Vega." I nodded once. He smiled, nervous, proud, then turned back to his unit. That's all it took. I wasn't the ghost in the corner of a family funeral anymore. I wasn't the name scrubbed from a chain of command or the subject of hushed rumors. I was someone who had returned, who stayed, and who showed up not to be seen, but to serve again. And in the way that life tends to echo itself, I could feel Elijah there with me. Not in a mystical sense, but in the way his belief in me had rearranged the shape of my silence. He had been the one to say over crackling phone calls and voice messages, "You were always the brave one, Alex," even when they didn't see it, especially then. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes for a moment. In my mind, I pictured the last thing he ever sent me, that USB drive. Not just a device, not just a mission, a legacy. He hadn't trusted anyone else with it, not a command, not even his closest friend, only me. Because he didn't see me as broken, he saw me as unfinished, and now so did I. The wind picked up slightly, brushing loose strands of hair from my forehead. I reached up and tucked them back under the knot I always wore on duty, tight, simple, clean. The camera of life, if such a thing existed, would have pulled back in that moment. It would have shown the young soldiers marching in unison, their feet pounding rhythm into the ground. It would have shown the base no longer a place of ghosts, but of momentum. And then it would have landed on me. Lieutenant Colonel Alexandra Vega, standing still, eyes fixed not on the past, but on the horizon. Shoulders square. Breathe calmly. Not waiting for applause. Not waiting for anyone to finally understand. Just standing. Present. Resilient. Unshaken. Not every victory looks like thunder. Some sounds quiet. Some arrive in the form of a handwritten letter, a name returned to honor, or a young recruit watching you from across a field and thinking, maybe I could become something like that. The world had tried to write me off. But the truth, I was never a story that ended early. I was a story that simply refused to die in silence. And now finally I could rest in that. Not as a soldier, not as a sister, but as a woman who came home not to be heard but to be whole.